Good evening, everyone. I'm Tony Paniagua. Welcome to Arizona Illustrated for Monday, the 21st of May, 2012. Many residents north of Phoenix remain evacuated from their small communities due to the threat of a fire that has been burning for more than a week. The Gladiator fire has scorched more than 14,000 acres in our state, and it's also serving as a reminder about the dangerous fire season that is predicted this year. Michael Chihak has an interview about this topic.
What are current fire conditions in the Coronado National Forest?
Well, right now we are set up to experience a above average fire season. There are a number of factors that are contributing to that. First, we are in an ongoing drought, so conditions are quite dry. We've seen a few storms come through, which have just brought really very short-term benefits, if any. So the fuels are very dry. Additionally, there are a lot of fine fuels, such as grasses and so forth, that are left behind from previous wet monsoon seasons. And in places that those didn't burn last year, they are still available. So they have dried out. They're flammable right now. As we proceed into the summer with the heat going up and conditions becoming even drier, then the fuels are going to dry out even more. So we're flammable now, and we're looking at it becoming even more so.
And are there fire restrictions in place now in the forest?
We are currently at the level of fire restrictions where there are no open fires allowed unless you are in a developed site using the pedestal grill or the metal fire ring provided, and no smoking is permitted unless you are in an area that is devoid of all flammable materials for 3 feet around you.
And those could escalate depending on conditions all the way to total restriction, right?
Right. It's a succession where we'll go into the least level of closures when conditions warrant. That's where we are now. And then as things become hotter and drier, the next stage would probably be no fires and no smoking. And then areas could be closed. And last year, the forest was closed. So that's a last-ditch effort. You know, that's something we really don't want to do unless the risk just becomes too great.
What kind of fire activity has there been in the forest so far this year?
Well, we are midway into May, and we've already had 33 fires for over 8,000 acres.
And is that ahead of average pace?
That's more than we would usually see at this time of the year.
And you said that the season would be expected to be above average this year. That's your anticipation. What is average? What do you mean when you say that?
Well, I can just give you a comparison that last year was above average for large fire activity. We saw a number of fires. We saw a number of ignitions that would start and grow to thousands of acres within hours. That's unusual. Also, we had a number of large fires across the Coronado. We had the Horseshoe 2 fire, the Murphy fire, the Monument fire, the Arlene fire. A lot of these fires that grew very large very quickly. That's above average. That's not normal fire activity.
So are you thinking that we could have devastating fires such as those again this year?
We are thinking we could see large fires again this year. Now, the thing that's working in our favor is we're not anticipating the winds that we had last year. Last year we had sustained winds, I believe, through June, and that not only spread fire more quickly, but it also grounded a lot of our aircraft that we were using for suppression purposes, and it would change our strategies. You know, we can't put firefighters in front of a wind-driven fire, so wind really complicates things, and this year it's not predicted to be as bad as it was last year.
Speaking of firefighters, what kind of resources are there in place or in preparation for an anticipated above-average season?
Okay, well, we have here across the forest 9 fire engines on each of our 5 ranger districts. We have our Coronado National Forest fire crew, hand crew. Other hand crews are available to us. We have a hot shot crew that's pre-positioned here on one of our ranger districts. Other hot shot crews can be ordered. We have an air tanker base set up at Fort Huachuca that we can fly air tankers in and out of. We have 8 heavy air tankers that are in the vicinity right now. They are currently working the fires up north, but should we have an ignition, that's what we refer to as initial attack when we go to fight it, and that takes priority. We have a helicopter also that is on the forest and another that's assigned, but it's currently away on a fire. So we are set up pretty well. We do have a lot of resources here, and there are additional resources that we can order if needed.
What else is it that the public needs to know about how the Forest Service prepares for fire season and then acts when emergencies occur?
Well, the Coronado is in fire season year-round at this point. So we always have our crews and our engines that are out on patrol, talking to people. We do fire prevention and education, and then early in the spring, through the winter and the spring, we'll start training up our firefighters, bringing our seasonals on. And we will bring on additional resources such as the helicopters. They are just here for fire season. Everybody will be trained up and positioned and out patrolling. Then when an ignition is detected, we go into what's called initial attack. And our nearest resources will go and try to suppress the fire. They'll call in what additional resources they need. Often these will be some of our partnering fire departments, our local and municipal fire departments. If they need air resources, then they will order those up as well. So we'll give it what we think is needed and hopefully catch it while it's small. The Forest Service puts out about 98% of our fires in initial attack. When it keeps them small, it keeps the costs down. Now, this isn't always possible, especially in some of these really dry desert conditions, and then you add a little wind and turn up the heat and turn down the humidity, and that complicates things even more. Also with that Coronado National Forest, a lot of our terrain is very, very steep, which affects both fire behavior and what firefighters can actually do in aircraft, how effective the aircraft can be. So there's a lot of things that go into what happens and how successful we are.
Now, not all fires can be prevented because, of course, we have lightning and natural causes, but human-caused fires can be prevented. What do you say to the public to help us live up to Smokey Bear's admonition that only you can prevent wildfires?
Well, people need to realize that we're in fire season year-round. So don't just think that you have to be careful with fire in summer. You know, if you're always thinking about this, fire safety, if it's always at the forefront, then that's how you're going to behave. And we encourage people always know before you go. If an area is in fire restrictions, know what they are, and please, please pay attention. They're there for a reason. If it's windy, if it's a windy day, do you really need a fire? You know, don't have one if you don't need one. And really important, never leave a fire unattended.
Millions of people have full-time jobs in this country, even 2 or more jobs. But they are still having a tough time making ends meet, especially in single-parent households. Here in Arizona, a new study is out that addresses the challenges for some of these families, since they often make too much money to qualify for assistance, but not enough money to pay for all of their needs. We recently spoke about this topic with Laura Penny, the executive director of the Southern Arizona Women's Foundation. She was joined by Dr. Diana Pierce from the University of Washington. She has been studying self-sufficiency figures in different states around the country. Laura Penny and Dr. Diana Pierce, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to be here.
Let's begin with you, Laura. So you commissioned this report. It's called the Self-Sufficiency Standard for Arizona 2012. What's that all about?
Well, the Women's Foundation of Southern Arizona makes grants to programs that benefit women and girls. And for the last 4 years, our focus has been on economic self-sufficiency, which begs the question, what is self-sufficient? How much does it really take for a family to make enough money to live without relying on public assistance? So that was the question that we set out to answer with this report.
And Diana, you've been going around the country doing these reports. If you could tell me a little bit about your background and how you decided to get involved with this specific topic.
I've been working on women's poverty for a long time. And so when it came up that we needed another kind of standard for what we usually define poverty as not being able to meet your basic needs, but our poverty measure has gotten way out of date and doesn't measure that the differences by place, by family type, et cetera. So I developed this standard to measure that and to make it very specific. So each state we look at down to the county level, sometimes even down to the city level, whatever the data permits us, to measure how much it costs to meet your basic needs for families with working age adults.
And one of the challenges that you have found is that there are gaps in which people don't qualify for public assistance because they make a little bit too much and therefore they're left out without any benefits?
You know, one of the things that when you add up the cost of housing, child care, transportation, and things like taxes, health care, which has gone up very fast, we find that that's a pretty high level. But what we find is that most of our programs are aimed for the very poor, the people that are really experiencing deprivation, not just poverty, but real deprivation. And that's appropriate, but it means that the people that are working but their wages aren't sufficient to meet the basic needs at a minimum level. And these budgets are really bare bones budgets. There's no takeout or restaurant food, not a pizza, not a latte. So they're really minimal. The amount we allow for like housing and childcare is the amount that's allowed by the government for people who are receiving assistance. So that means that it is really bare bones. Nevertheless, it's much higher than where you would qualify for help if you're below it. So there's a lot of people that are below these standards, especially if you have young children and you've got childcare costs. But they're well above what they would to qualify for help with childcare or food or whatever.
And Laura, why try to obtain this information, and what do you hope to do with it? How do you hope to engage the community, if you will?
Well, I mean, I think there's room here for some public policy discussions, especially if we're concerned about the health and well-being of the next generation of Arizonans. I mean, we have closed the doors to some programs that are really important to families, like child care subsidy, like kids care. And what that means is that we are going to perpetuate another generation that grows up in poverty because they don't have access to some very basic health and well-being measures.
And Dr. Pierce, when states say, well, we just don't have the funds, how do you respond?
I say, well, that's priorities, and we need to do everything we can to gather those resources. And for states that don't have them, we can also call upon federal resources, things like food stamps or federal programs, and that can help families meet their basic needs. One of the things we have found is that there's just an increasing gap that families are facing because their wages aren't going up as fast as the costs are going up. So costs are going up at about 3% a year in the last decade since we first calculated the standard. And wages are going up less than 2% a year. So that gap keeps getting bigger and bigger for many families.
So what were the numbers like for Arizona? Pretty dismal, pretty good compared to other states? Have you had a chance to take a look at those numbers?
Well, because we do the statistics on a county-by-county basis, you can't really do a state-by-state comparison. The cost of living, if you will, in Tucson is similar to cities like Salt Lake City, Louisville, Kentucky. So we can compare sort of metropolitan areas or counties, but if you average across the state, then you've diluted the power of the report because it really does look at regional differences. So
if you could have a magic wand and do something right now to help people in Southern Arizona, what would it be, Laura?
I think, as a state, we need to look at policies that provide supports to people who are barely above the poverty limit, people who are still really poor, even though they don't fall below the federal limit, and find a way to support those families as they move to self-sufficiency.
Okay, well, Laura Penny, the Executive Director of the Women's Foundation of Southern Arizona, and Diana Pierce, Ph.D., thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's been more than a year since hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East took to the streets to demand political changes in their respective countries. The violence continues in places like Syria, but in other nations such as Egypt, its citizens are beginning new chapters with upcoming historic elections. Next, we are joined by Tucson resident and author Laila Abou-Saif, who is paying close attention to the dramatic changes in Egypt. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So let's begin with the process. Elections are this Wednesday and Thursday, May 23rd and 24th. What happens?
People will go and vote in the closest place to their school district. And the computers now are in full swing and everybody knows where to go to vote. Usually the turnout for votes is 25% of the population votes, sometimes 18, but this year it's so well organized that it's going to be probably more than 25% of the population. So once they find out where their school district is, where their school, the nearest school to them is, they just have to go there and cast a ballot. And there are 13, last I heard, candidates, and people will just decide which candidate they want, although, of course, there are, from what I heard, 2 prominent candidates who figured in a debate televised very much like the American presidential debates. And these 2 candidates are Amr Moussa and Abdelmenem Abou-Saif.
And let me ask you about those 2 candidates.
Yes.
You were telling me prior to this interview that voters are going to have a very clear distinction into the way of the future for their country insofar as leadership and whether it's going to become or remain a secular country or become more in tune with religion.
Well, the 2 leaders, if I may express, represent these 2 trends, secular and religious. The Muslim Brotherhood controls 75% of the parliament, as is well known. And if they elect Abdelmenem Abou-Saif or Mohammed Morsi, then we will have a completely religious, almost religious government, at least in the legislature. Sharia is already, 99% of Egyptian law is already Sharia, but there is still the 1% which will make it a theocracy, and that would be the penal code. However, to go back to Amr Moussa, whom I happen to know, is a career diplomat. He used to be the ambassador to the United States from Egypt. He was head of the Arab League. His wife studied at Columbia University computer programming. He's a global figure and a globalized man who will continue taking Egypt into the middle of the road, which is neither Islamic nor Western, but which is not closing the doors to the West and to Western thinking. Egypt has been a secular society for 2,000 years. But if someone, and this is my opinion, if someone like Abdelmenem Abou-Saif or even Mohammed Morsi come into power, then you will have probably a very different society. Eventually there will be laws passed which will be more Islamic oriented. There might even be a change in the banking system. They might forbid Western banking because its usury is forbidden in Islam. And the society might change gradually like a chameleon, but change to close itself off from the West and particularly from the United States.
So what happens if nobody gets more than 50% of the votes this week? Because I understand there's 13 candidates, lots of choices right now.
Then I think there's a new election which will take place, and they will try again. That's the best. Well, that's what I heard. But the good thing is that these elections are taking place because there was so much turbulence in the past couple of weeks that there was a fear that these elections would never take place. But it would seem like that they are going to go forward.
And then we only have about 30 seconds or so, but the people that you have spoken to in Egypt, what are they saying? Are they excited? Are they concerned? How are they feeling emotionally?
It depends on who you speak to, of course. But I mean, people who are westernized or who are business people are voting for Amr Moussa, I think, but nobody knows what the outcome is. But people are excited and people are engaged.
Okay, well, Laila Abou-Saif, thank you very much, and we appreciate you coming in here, and we'll see what happens.
Thank you.
The developments in the Middle East have been followed by millions of people around the world, and journalists from different countries have been a vital part of this mix. We continue the conversation about Egypt and its possible political ramifications with a University of Arizona graduate student and former Arizona Public Media radio intern. She has traveled to the Middle East in the past, but now she's returning to Egypt this week.
Joining us in the studio now is Britton Eakin. She's been working with us here at Arizona Public Media the past few months, and she's heading to Cairo soon. Thanks for joining us, Britton.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So you're heading to Cairo, Egypt very soon. Tell us what you're going to be doing there.
So I'm going to be working with a newspaper called the Egypt Independent. I'm going to be interning with them and hopefully going out in the field with a lot of their reporters, shadowing them, following them around, but also having the opportunity to work on some of my own stories, which is very exciting to me as a journalism student.
And is your work going to revolve around presidential elections, or what do you think you'll be focusing on?
Well, I'll be arriving right in the middle of the presidential elections, so that will sort of be my welcome to Cairo. But I presume that for the first couple of weeks, I'll be getting my feet on the ground, sort of figuring things out. So I'll probably be mostly dealing with what happens after the elections. But I'm also really interested in looking at how the results of the elections might impact the relationship between Israel and the whole Palestinian issue. So those are some of the subject areas that I'm looking forward to covering.
And as you're preparing to head overseas, how do you think the media landscape there has changed since the revolution, since we were all hearing about all the Arab Spring movements more than a year ago?
Well, from what I've been told and from what I have seen, the media landscape has changed pretty dramatically. There's been a huge opening in terms of press freedom. Having said that, there's still a lot of crackdowns. Journalists are not necessarily free to criticize SCAF, which is the current military leadership in Egypt. But they are working on the first freedom of information law in Egypt. And I think journalists, for the first time, feel empowered to be more critical and to report on topics that were previously off limits to them. So it's actually a very exciting time for journalism in Egypt.
And the paper you're going to work for, we were talking, is actually something that started after the revolution?
Yes, according to my understanding, it was founded in November of 2011, and it is sort of a sister paper to a publication called Al-Masri Al-Yawm, which was founded in 2004. And at the time, it was sort of hailed as, the opening of independent media in Egypt. So this is sort of an English offshoot of Al-Masri Al-Yawm. But it's an interesting case because during their second publication, the chief editor of Al-Masri Al-Yawm wanted to censor one of the op-ed pieces because it was critical of SCAF, of the military leadership. At the time, Egypt Independent wasn't independent of Al-Masri Al-Yawm. They didn't have their own license, so they sort of had to go along with it. But they decided that they would stop publication of the paper, print publication, until they could operate independently. So I think what that says is there is a sort of a push forward, a momentum moving forward to have a real thriving independent media.
Now, you kind of touched on this before, but how do you feel this election, the presidential election in Egypt, will play into the overall political scope in the Middle East?
Well, I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens, but I think that the U.S. and Israel will be watching the outcome of this election very carefully. There's been a lot of rhetoric in the Egyptian presidential campaign in terms of the peace treaty with Israel, and I think a lot of Egyptians want to see a change in that relationship, but what actually happens once the new president is elected and is in office, they'll actually have to govern. It's not likely that that we'll see a change in that peace treaty with Israel, but nonetheless, that relationship is changing, and I think that we'll have to keep an eye on it.
And what do you think Americans need to know about the upcoming presidential elections there? I'm sure as you prepare to go, you might be facing a few stereotypes from Americans.
Sure, I get a lot of questions from Americans about whether or not I'm going to have to cover. The answer is no. I think there's also a lot of fear surrounding words like Islamist and Muslim Brotherhood. And I think there's a lot of fear-mongering in the American media about Islamist party victories in Tunisia and Egypt. I think it's important for Americans to understand that these parties are well established, they're well organized, and they have the ability to really mobilize the population. Some of the newer parties aren't as well established. They're not as well organized. It will take time. So we might actually see the Islamist parties fail in office. It's important to remember that the revolution is ongoing. It's not over. Just because they're going to elect a president, there's a lot of questions that remain in terms of how much power will the military leadership continue to have. The demands of the revolution have not been met yet. The new president is going to have a lot of issues to deal with. They're going to have to really meet the needs of the people. So it's an ongoing process, and we'll have to wait and see what happens.
And of course, we know this is not the only international election going on this year. Mexico is having presidential elections this summer. How do you think this will play into the American presidential election that's happening politicians will be campaigning this summer as these other changes are happening?
Well, depending on the outcome and whether or not we see an Islamist Party candidate win, we might see an escalation in rhetoric in the U.S. presidential race in terms of Islamist parties. We might see more of a focus on Israel and dealing with, maintaining the peace treaty. But again, it's important for Americans to understand that Egyptians have their own perspective. And we sort of need to, at this point in time, understand that perspective a little better, I think.
All right. Well, Britton Eakin, thank you again for joining us in our studios to talk about these issues.
Thank you for having me, Andrea.
Millions of people around the world headed outside yesterday to enjoy the solar eclipse, and residents in southern Arizona were no exception. In tonight's video postcard by Matt Eriks and Eric Rodden, we share a bit of the enthusiasm and sense of wonder with amateur astronomers.
Yeah, it is.
Well, we came out here to enjoy the eclipse of the sun out here in the desert. It was pretty good turnout. I guess for a once-in-a-lifetime event like this, it's pretty awesome.
We're enjoying a happening. All these people have descended on Saguaro Monument West to look at the sun and the moon. It's going to be near total with 87% of the disk covered.
I'm just going to have to see if I can... I lost it again. There it is.
It's a natural event that's nothing to be afraid of. This is going to happen. Whatever we do, there's nothing we can do to affect it. It's happening. Shows an interest in the world, a positive one, and it's always nice to be reminded of things greater than ourselves. I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful.
Coming up tomorrow night, we'll talk about your health and medical services from different perspectives. Nationally, there's a big need for nurses and doctors in many areas. We'll hear about some efforts that are trying to tackle this issue. And the local resident is getting ready for the trip of a lifetime. He won a contest to take part in a suborbital spaceflight. I'm Tony Paniagua. From all of us at Arizona Public Media, have a great night.